Last month, I drove my car from the north to the south and returned while I was in Ireland. I took a brief flight to Dublin because I'm originally from London, and then I rented a car to drive up to North Ireland before heading down to the west coast. It was pleasant, other than the terrible weather, which is to be expected while visiting Ireland. Since I am a thrifty student, I spent the majority of my 5 nights away at a hostel. I only intended to remain for 4 nights, but after the 4th I felt compelled to return to the same location. I'm getting ahead of myself though, so let's go back to the beginning. I was in the vicinity of Cork, one of Ireland's larger cities, after the 4th day. However, I discovered a little settlement just west of the city. Around 5 p.m., I made the decision to dine at a small town bar and search for a place to stay the night. I never made any reservations in advance since I liked the feeling of finding a place to stay that was both comfortable and had a unique story when I got there. I didn't want to stay at any hotels, so I asked the bartender if he had any recommendations. He instructed me to head straight down the road from the outside for almost 3 miles, after which I was to turn left at an information station where someone would undoubtedly know of a location with the setting I was looking for. I thanked him, had a modest burger and fries, and ordered a beer. It was becoming dark outside by this point, so I did what the bartender instructed. However, there were 2 possibilities available to me when I reached the gravel road. The bartender had told me about the information station, which was marked with the letter I on a sign to the left. Then there was a little wooden sign that read, "Bed and breakfast, 2 miles." With handwritten letters painted in white and an arrow pointing to the right, I chose a right turn because I reasoned that because it was a Friday night after the sun had set, no one would be at the information center anyhow, and the B&B seemed welcoming enough. I came at a huge mansion with porch lights on after 2 kilometers of following more arrowed signs. The same styled sign that read, "Welcome to Sethers's Bed and Breakfast," was placed next to the large door. The headlights of my car shone into the shadowy woodland that surrounded the entire home as I parked in front of it. I entered the warm hall behind the front door and was met by an elderly woman who I would estimate to be in her 70s. "Hello, sweetheart. Would you like to stay the night or just have a cup of tea?" she grinned at me. "If you don't mind, it would be great if you have any rooms left," I answered. After staring at me for a few moments without moving, she nodded slowly, very slowly. "I have a room upstairs that is free, of course." Because of the instability of my economy, I asked her how much it would cost. She assured me that there would be no issues and that we would talk about payment in the morning. She showed me a bedroom where I could read books and listen to podcasts for a few hours before falling asleep without realizing it. There was a loud thump from the ceiling that I believe would have woken me up 2 hours later. It sounded like someone dropping something heavy, except it only thumped once rather than bouncing. I ignored it and proceeded to switch off the ceiling light. But as soon as I was beneath the blanket once more, the thump continued, this time coming from the window on the wall. This time it sounded precisely the same and was equally loud. Then it struck again, directly behind me this time, and I flinched in fear. What on earth was this? After my heart slowed down, it didn't return, and I was able to return to sleep. A little later, I woke up once more, this time by the very sluggish opening of my room's door. Had I not been certain that I had locked it? Because the door was opening so slowly, it made a horrible squeak sound. There was nobody there when I noticed the light coming from the hallway. The loud thumps on the floor, which sounded like someone running towards me, halted just next to the bed, exactly beside me, as soon as the door stopped opening. Since I was unable to see anything, I switched on the bedroom lamp in the hopes of seeing someone or something nearby, but I was mistaken. I knew I was awake, even though I initially believed I was still dreaming. I looked at my phone and saw that it was 6 a.m. After what had transpired, I was surprisingly able to fall back asleep, so I left the light on for the remainder of the night. I woke up again at about 9:30, and based on what I could see outside the window, the sun had risen. After the night's events, I prepared to go, so I packed up my belongings. A man, who I later learned was her husband, was standing next to the woman as she prepared a traditional English breakfast downstairs in the kitchen. As soon as I stepped into the kitchen tiles, they both turned their heads in my direction at the same time, perfectly in time. After her husband returned to cooking, the woman asked me if she had a good night's sleep. Yeah, but I could definitely hear the other guests through the walls, so I think they must have been noisy or something. After that, they both burst out laughing, and I just stood there looking uncomfortable for a few minutes. We never have any other visitors at our house this weekend, honey. The woman said, "They're all too scared," and then resumed her laughter. Confusion was consuming my thoughts. What was she trying to say? Was this a prank of some sort? After discussing payments with the Sethers, I felt nauseous because I was so terrified of them. I informed them that I had things to accomplish today, graciously declined breakfast, and gave them cash. I decided to ask the bartender what he knew about them when I returned to the pub from yesterday. "The name seems familiar to you. I'll have an explanation if you return tomorrow." He informed me, "My girlfriend is from here, so she knows everyone in town. If you want, I'll ask her about it tonight." I informed him of what had transpired during the night and thanked him. I didn't want to come across as completely insane, so I said that I must have dreamt about what had happened. He found it intriguing and assured me that if I choose to stay another night in town, he would provide me with an explanation regarding the Sethers. I needed answers because I was too intrigued by this to simply go home. I therefore opted to stay at the B&B for an additional night and rescheduled my flight from Saturday night to mid-Sunday. I wanted to convince myself that I was either 1, not dreaming, or 2, merely seeing things in my groggy state. I didn't really do anything significant during the day, just wandered around town. Desperate to have the same experience again, I returned to the house as the sun was setting and spent another night there. In order to avoid disturbing the woman, I paid her immediately this time so that I may depart early for my journey tomorrow morning. This time, we didn't say much, but when I gave her a brief update on my day, she continued to nod gently. As I ascended the stairs, she remarked to me, "Sleep tight, my dear." She was grinning and staring at me with her mouth open, exposing her teeth, when I turned to face her again. Her gaze gave me the chills, so I hurried upstairs and turned to face the identical room from the previous evening. I was awakened in the middle of the night by the thump once more. Only the wall with the window facing the front of the house was affected this time. Since the torchlights were still on, I made the decision to get up and gaze through the window. My automobile was the only thing on the gravel outside the course. So where was the source of this sound? No one would be tall enough to slam into this wall, yet I was on the second floor. As yesterday, I turned on the bedside lamp and closed the blinds once more. Instead of waiting for the door to open, I got up, made sure it was locked, and positioned a chair so that nothing or no one could enter. The beating against the wall had ceased, and I felt safer. The duvet was ripped off my body, off the bed, and onto the floor just as I was falling back asleep. In an attempt to determine who or what may have swiftly removed it from me, I swung my eyes open. However, nothing. I was the only person there. Terrified, I put on my headphones and listened to soothing music before going back to sleep with all the lights on in the room. I just wanted to get through the night and head home because I was sick of this. At 7:45, my alarm went off and I prepared to depart by getting dressed and packing my belongings. The chair was no longer in front of the door when I was approaching it. In fact, it was no longer in the room. However, the door remained locked. What the heck is going on? I had to get out, so I hurried to my car. On the way out, I didn't want to see the Sethers. However, as I shut the front door, I could hear them laughing, the same coordinated laugh from the previous day. I chose to ignore it since I had to leave this place as soon as possible. I promptly took a car to the pub. Even though it was only 8:30, I could see the bartender I knew cleaning up behind the counter through the window. I softly tapped on the glass door, which was locked. The bartender came to open the door after noticing me and grinning. "Yeah, here are the answers," he said. After entering, I sat on the bar stools in front of the counter and informed him that I had to head to the airport soon. Before returning to the task of cleaning my glasses, he handed me a newspaper and said, I knew the name sounded familiar. The top page of the black and white newspaper stated August 18, 1932. Without a word, I dropped the paper and sprinted back to my car. As fast as I could without breaking the law, I drove back to the Sethers house. Older couple found dead inside their home. Police suspect suicide. Read the headline on the newspaper's top page. Mr. and Miss Cedars were seen in the photo, waving and grinning in front of their home. Even the placard on their doorstep had vanished by the time I returned to their mansion. I knocked on the door, but nobody answered. I needed someone to open the door and let me know that this was all a hoax, since I was freaking out by this time. However, all of the lights were off, and it appeared as though no one had been home for a long time based on the views from the windows. I decided to never return to this establishment after throwing up right there and then before getting back in my car. I feel so queer. I've spent the last month or so thinking about this story and replaying it in my mind. The Sethers were who? What? Who caused those noises in the middle of the night? In that house, who did I speak with? With whom did I speak in that house? I mean, after a long night of stacking shelves at my neighborhood grocery store, I had just returned home. I typically arrived home about midnight because I worked the closing shift. I lived with my roommate, Mark, in an inexpensive apartment. I felt fortunate to have a place to live that wasn't my parents' basement, even though we weren't in the greatest neighborhood. After placing my jacket on the coat rack near the front entrance, I went into the kitchen to look through the refrigerator for a snack. I noticed something strange after taking a frozen burrito out of the freezer. I had passed the hallway with my bedroom door slightly open. I realized this may not seem odd at first, but I vividly recall shutting it when I departed for work that morning. I always remember to close my door when I leave for the day, since I value my privacy. Returning to the living room, I glanced down the hallway. I called, "Hello." Dead quiet fell. I crossed the living room and turned on the hallway light switch, determined not to let the fear overcome me. "Mark, is that you?" I inquired. Since Mark had always been a little strange, I couldn't help but wonder if he was pulling a strange practical joke on me. When I walked into my room, I might have been waiting to jump out of my closet or something. I pulled the bedroom door open softly when I eventually reached it. Much of the room was lit by the light from the hallway. I looked around and could definitely feel the eerie atmosphere. Nothing appeared unusual, and there was nobody there. My twin bed as usual, with my nightstand to the left. I walked back into the kitchen after shutting the door. I pressed the start button and put my dinner in the microwave. I switched on the television to watch a scary movie and unwind while that was cooking. Suddenly, from down the hall, I heard a muffled thump. Since the neighbors may be quite noisy at times, and hearing a loud bump in the night is common, I initially assumed it was them or something. However, it recurred, and this time I was certain it was coming from the opposite end of the hall. "Mark?" I called again. I almost had a heart attack when the microwave beeped at that precise moment. "Yes, I apologize." Something was dropped. "Through the door," I heard him say. I'll admit, I felt a little better knowing that Mark was home. I walked back into the kitchen to get my food, and that's when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from Mark. "Hey dude, running a little late here at work. Could you please leave the door unlocked for me?" My stomach fell to the floor and a shudder rushed down my spine. I replied back, "Wait, you're still at work." It took him barely a few seconds to reply. "Yeah, why?" I looked up as I heard another commotion coming from the hallway. The silhouette of a gigantic man was standing there, carrying what appeared to be a butcher's knife. Hearing the heavy clang of the man's boots behind me, I turned and rushed to the front door. He wasn't rushing. Instead, it sounded like he was simply walking, taking his time. I didn't stop to look back. I ran down the emergency staircase and out into the parking lot, where I called the cops. Dylan was never a talkative boy. At the time, we were the only ones living at home. Dylan's mother, my late wife Angie, had passed away a year earlier, leaving me a single father. While riding around a steep bend, she was struck by a car, although the driver was never recognized. I won't go into further detail because, to be honest, I'd rather not go through that time again, but it's safe to say that it broke me. I made an effort to gather myself and remain resilient for Dylan. Did I do well enough? God alone is aware. I didn't hear back. Dylan became even more reclusive after that, essentially keeping quiet unless someone spoke to him. He was evaluated by a child psychologist and several other members of the school's welfare team, but they concluded that he didn't have autism or anything similar, because he was quiet and wanted to keep to himself, but he could speak up when prompted. After verifying that I was Dylan's father, the officer questioned me. At last, he informed us that they would look for the man and that we should report him if we saw him again. It was a jumble of what the teacher and principal stated. All I can recall is trembling knees and a lot of perspiration as I struggled to process the idea that my son had been abducted. "Dylan, you didn't know that man, did you?" questioned the principal. Dylan gave a head shake. That day left me feeling tense. I couldn't bear the thought that Dylan might be in danger because he was my entire world and my only remaining family. I felt ill from it. This bastard was who? Why my son? Was it some random creep, or did he know us? After that, I was always on time to get Dylan up from school and always walked him there and back. Dylan, meanwhile, didn't appear to be at all alarmed. Unless pressed, he never brought up the incident. I assumed at the time that he was simply shy and didn't want to start a fight. The same homeroom teacher called me over her lunch break a few weeks after the incident. She claimed that one of the students in her class overheard Dylan conversing with a man across the school's fence. The man was gone when she hurried out. Dylan claimed he hadn't been speaking to anyone when questioned about it. When questioned further, the girl who reportedly saw him insisted she saw Dylan speaking to a tall, lanky man with untidy black hair. The cops were called again, made a cursory search of the perimeter of the school, but they discovered no one suspicious. I seated Dylan at the kitchen table that afternoon. "I won't be upset, I just need you to tell me the truth," I continued, trying to control my anxieties. "Did you or didn't you chat to a stranger today at school? Yes or no?" He gave a shrug. It was as difficult as extracting blood from a stone to get an answer from him. "How often have we warned you against interacting with strangers? You realize that it's for your personal safety, don't you, son?" He nodded, appearing a little alarmed. As soon as I realized I had raised my voice, I felt bad. I left him at the dining table and went straight to bed since I was so frustrated and only had 2 hours of sleep left. I woke up around 2 in the morning that night and used the restroom. While I was at it, I made the decision to see how Dylan was doing. His room was empty. I yelled his name and scanned the kitchen and living room, growing increasingly anxious as the seconds passed. I searched closets, nooks, and even cupboards that were useless to search because he would never fit inside, but I was desperate and believed he had been abducted. I walked out onto the street and raced up and down it like a crazy person while shouting his name, but to no avail. I made a final check in Dylan's room before heading back inside to call the police. He was sitting up on his bed, wide awake and staring back at me. "Where were you?" Alarmed but relieved, I asked. "I was here," he said. "No, you weren't. You weren't in here while I searched everywhere for you." "I was." "Was it all in my head?" I shook my head, anticipating a migraine. "Please just remain in your room. Do not frighten me." The uneasiness was starting to get to me, and I felt like my eyes had somehow tricked me. The window was wide open, and maybe I should have noticed. A knock on my flat door occurred around a year following those encounters. Dylan was playing Minecraft in his room while I was inside finishing off some papers. I was alert at once. The door was never knocked on. Friends or acquaintances would always wait outside the main door, ring the doorbell, and I would receive them downstairs in the apartment building where we resided. This implied that the person in need was probably a neighbor, either upstairs or downstairs. We weren't close at all, but I did have some of their numbers from when we moved in case we needed to get in touch. I pondered what might be wrong. I approached the door and peered through the peephole. Nobody was present. Strange, maybe I had heard something? At that point, second-guessing myself was just part of my nature, and those random events were now normal. I heard another knock as I made my way back to my desk in the living room. There was a problem. I approached the door once more. Through the peephole, nobody could be seen. Were we being tricked? I contacted my upstairs neighbor to ask if he had knocked on the door when I was standing just behind it. I heard footsteps upstairs a short while later, heading toward the door and then quickly returning to the apartment. Then, around a minute later, I got a text back. Avoid opening the door. A man with an enormous knife is crouched and hiding next to your door. Once more, my phone buzzed. My neighbor upstairs texted me again. Call the cops. RN. Stay indoors. When I came to my senses, I tiptoed to Dylan's room. Stay inside. Keep quiet. I whispered, my eyes bulging, beads of sweat streaming down my forehead. My heart had never pounded so rapidly. As I carefully closed his door and stood outside, ready to shit myself and throw up at the same time, Dylan looked up and arched his eyebrows. We were so motionless that I could hear more hurried footsteps and hushed but intense conversation upstairs. To make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me, I read my upstairs neighbor's texts once more. Fearing a madman would burst through the door at any moment, I crept to the kitchen and retrieved one of my own kitchen knives before returning to the same location outside Dylan's room. I mentally recited frantic prayers for protection. There was no sound coming from his chamber. After what felt like years, my heart rate began to slightly settle down when I heard sirens in the distance. I relaxed my hold on the knife handle. After a while, I heard more footsteps, slamming and shouting, all of which gradually decreased in volume. "The police are here!" a voice shouted. With my knife still in hand, I opened the door after making sure it was a police officer by looking through the peephole. And they told us that a tall, lanky man with black hair had just been caught and taken into police custody, which was quite comforting. He was waiting for someone inside to open my door after knocking. Yes, he had a freshly sharpened knife and was waiting. To me, the first person to open that door. What was he going to do with it? Your guess is as good as mine, though, if it isn't evident. Gregory was the name of this man. Without a fixed location, he appeared to move about a lot, often traveling between states and committing small-time offenses like harassment, stealing, and occasionally stalking children. Upon conducting a more comprehensive investigation, they discovered that he and his accomplices had been engaged in at least one horrific murder in another state, for which they were sentenced to life in prison. Although I wouldn't have wanted anyone to experience such fear, these regrettable events do occur. I've always been affected by the psychological harm I sustained that day, but I chose to see the good side and consider myself fortunate because I know folks who have experienced comparable tragedies but have never survived to tell the story. There will be victims wherever there are sick monsters. I assumed that the sicko's incarceration would be the end of it. However, I didn't discover the other side of the story until 10 years after the incident. Dylan was about to move away from home for the first time to attend college. Still obedient, but steadfastly quiet, he had developed into a tall child with an unexpected number of friends. I discovered a rough-looking old notebook in the back of his bottom drawer while organizing his belongings and cleaning out his room. Dylan's diary, the cover stated. When I first glanced through it without intending to investigate, I noticed that he had written and drawn a great deal in it, in remarkably neat handwriting. I was interested since he had always been a quiet boy. I started on the very first page. Cody's house 11 AYM on page 1. He must return my coat to me. A few sketches of stick figures were there. Page 2. Next week's English class requires a book. Find out if Amy has one. I turned the pages, and the first few were filled with the same humdrum primary school day-to-day events, mixed in with a few doodling. Then, I went to page 21. You spelled almost everyone's name right. Page 21. Why does my dad talk so much? There's no point in talking back. Additionally, he won't let me stay at Cody's house. There's no point in talking back. I despise him. My heart sank, and I felt a sting. I had strong memories of that day, and I felt guilty. I flipped the page. Page 22. Today I saw Greg. He claims he can assist me in getting rid of my father. He claims to have done it before, but I told him he was lying. It made headlines. I flipped through the earlier pages as my brain made the connections. Greg was mentioned for the first time in this passage. Despite my perspiration, I kept reading. Page 23, Greg and I are developing a strategy. Need Dad gone. But I almost got caught talking to him today. Mrs. Watford, that stupid old mole rat kept asking me. She took me to the principal's office again. I assume Katie spotted Greg and snitched. Need to be careful. A few blank pages, with a few in between packed with scribbles and admin notes to self. Then the narrative continued. Page 41. The word plan was underlined with 2 drawings underneath. The first was of a stick figure kneeling by a door, holding what looked like a dagger. This stick figure was smiling. There was another stick figure behind the door, with its hand on the door handle, about to open the door. The second was of the first stick figure stabbing the stick man, who had just opened the door. His eyes now 2 crosses. Page 42. Greg came to my house and I showed him my plan. He said that was good and he could do it. We almost got caught by Dad, but I went back in bed just in time. H gonna fetch some tools from his residence. Close 1. Page 43. Greg screwed up. Hez in jail now. Why did Dad not open the door when Greg knocked? Everything went wrong. I have no idea why. Page 44. I wish my dad would just shut up. I flicked through the rest of the journal, which was blank. Page 44 was the last entry. I read the entries a few times and pondered what I should do. I never imagined Dylan was capable of such evil intents. Confused and upset, I acted as if nothing had occurred for a few days. But on the day he was about to depart for college, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I brought his duffel bag down and fastened it on his suitcase. He stood outside the door with his bag and suitcase, ready to go to the station.